Okay, here is our down and dirty intro to Illustrator. If you're new to Illustrator, have no fear, it just takes a little practice, and if you've worked in Photoshop at all, you're way ahead of the game. The main difference between the two programs is that Photoshop is for raster or pixel-based images, which are best for photo editing and digital painting, whereas Illustrator is for vector graphics, which is ideal for logos, illustrations, and designs that need to scale without losing quality. Okay, let's get started with a quick exercise. When we open up Illustrator, we can choose New File, and we see this document dialog box pop up. And this allows us to set the size and number of our artboards. So over in measurements, we're going to change our units to inches, and we're going to type in, let's do 8 inches high by 6 inches wide. So let's go ahead and put in 8 artboards, and then we'll set a bleed of 1/8 of an inch or 1/4 inch. This allows for borderless printing so that you can draw right off the edge of your artboard and ensure that when you print your file, there won't be a border around it. We'll set our color mode to CMYK and raster effects to 150 or 300. It's always safe to go with 300. 150 can be helpful when you have a very large file, and this kind of illustrates one of the fundamental differences between raster files and vector files. Remember, raster files are what we use in photo editing in Photoshop, and vector files are what we use here in Illustrator. And because vector files are scalable infinitely and don't ever worry, we don't have to worry about them being pixelated, we can always change this later. But we'll stick with 300 ppi and choose CMYK since we're printing. If this was just for a web application, we could choose RGB. More options allows you to adjust the spacing between artboards and their order, and we'll create our document. Your bleed areas are outlined in red. The artboard is everything that's in white, and your canvas or pasteboard is what's referred to as the gray area around the artboard, and you can always move unwanted items onto that pasteboard and not worry about them printing or exporting. So now we have our 8 artboards. Let's go ahead and navigate to our type tool, which is also shortcut T, which is the same as Photoshop. And we're going to click in our top left artboard, and it'll give us a little bit of placeholder text, and we'll just hit the number 1. So we've created the number 1, but it's tiny. We'll hit the escape key, which escapes you out of text entry mode, and you'll notice on the toolbar that your text tool is no longer selected. It's now back on the black arrow or move tool. And we'll go to our properties panel. If you haven't seen the properties panel, we'll go to Window, Properties, and change the size of the type. I'll put in 200 or 800, whatever it takes to kind of really fill up this space. And we can also change the font. Here I'm going to choose Minion Variable. You notice right away that it's not in the center of the artboard, and so we could use the arrow key to reposition, but let's go and be a little more exact. So ordinarily we'd go to our properties panel to do this, but we want to see all of our tools with less space taken up. So let's go to Window, Workspace, Essentials, Classic. Then we can close this properties panel and have a little bit more space to work with. On this top bar, we'll look for our horizontal align center and vertical align center. You'll notice that it doesn't actually align vertically the way we would expect it to. And this is because, as with every alphabet, there are a lot of letters that would go below the line you write on. So it's essentially, if you were to type a lowercase g or p or y, it would hang down. So instead, we'll have to move this by hand. So we'll use our down arrows to shift down. And if we hold our shift key, it moves a lot quicker. Okay, now with this number 1 selected, we'll choose Edit, Cut. And then we'll say Edit, Paste on all artboards. Now we have 1s on all the boards, and they're all aligned with the number 1 and exactly in the right spot. Now we'll be in our Type tool again and drag over each number and just change them to 2, 3, 4, and so on. Here we can save it and make sure that Create PDF Compatible File is checked, and we'll save this to our desktop. Okay, now let's try importing a file. So we'll say Create New File. And then we have 2 options. We can either hit File and Place and find our file on the desktop and place it on the artboard, or we can just simply click and drag it from our desktop onto our artboard. We'll go to Window, Image Trace, and choose a preset or stick with the custom adjustments as you would like. I like to go with the custom adjustments. And the reason that we have to go through image trace is right now, this is a raster image. This is an image that is based on pixels. So we need to turn it into a vector. So image trace will do that for us. I'm going to set my settings here. I like to have these 2 be high. You can see what happens when they're low. And I like my noise real low. Now We can expand it, and if it's not expandable, first we need to trace it, and then we can expand, and now it's converted into a vector image. If we switch to our white arrow, the direct selection tool, we present it with a lot of anchor points that we can manipulate manually. This is really what's great about Illustrator. So we can mess around with that. And it's important to note that when we image traced our image, we didn't just trace the black lines, we also traced the white lines, the white space in between them, rather. So here I'm selecting the outer edge of this black shape, and I can expand it and move it and manipulate it. But if we choose the inner edge, we're actually grabbing the inside shape, which is quite different and can be really frustrating. You'll notice that it overlaps with the white. This can be really frustrating if you don't want this to work this way, and so I'll show you how to fix that in just a second. All right, now let's draw into our image a little bit. Just like in Photoshop, if I start drawing right away, I'm drawing in the same layer as my image. I'd rather draw in a separate layer so that I can turn it on and off or just delete it if I need to. So now's a good time to look at our layers panel. When we first open up, this icon over here is so small, it's hard to see what each layer contains, especially as we get a little more complicated. So I'll click the flyout icon in the top right, go to the panel options and change to a custom setting of 60 pixels. And now we have a nice large view. Next in that, I'll add a new layer and begin drawing here. There are numerous drawing tools that we can use. Here is our line segment tool, which allows us to draw straight lines. And if you notice that your lines aren't really there, like every time you draw one, the other one disappears, like I'm seeing here, that's probably because your line stroke is set to nil. So we want to go up here and choose our stroke weight and make sure that it's a color instead of just an X out white box. The fill is less important. It would be important if we're working with shapes, but our lines here are so thin that the fill won't show anyway. And then we can mess around with the arc tool and the spiral tool, and they work fairly the same. We also have pencil tool, we have a brush tool, just like in Photoshop. We also have eraser tools and other drawing and editing tools that we can mess around with. In addition to drawing on top of it, we can also manipulate our assets by changing their color or adding a gradient or that sort of thing. But here I'm going to step back to what we said earlier about those white spaces in between and how our image trace selected those as objects in and of themselves. Here I've opened up two artboards and placed the exact same image on top of them. And on the left, I'm going to do exactly what we did before. We're going to select the item, go to our image trace panel, and make the adjustments we need, say trace, and then expand. But on the right panel, I'm going to make one small adjustment. After I've set all of my levels, I'm also going to click on Ignore Color, and I'm going to make sure that Ignore Color is set to white. This way, it's going to not look at those white spaces as objects themselves. Now, when we go to edit them by trying to insert a gradient, you can see the difference between the two. I've selected everything on the left, and I apply a gradient to it. And I've selected everything on the right and applied a gradient to it. Without those white objects, we have quite a different result. As you're seeing by now, Illustrator works well with clearly delineated shapes, objects, and lines. But what if we want to bring in something other that's a little more complex than a black and white line drawing? We can bring photos into Illustrator and work with them, but with some expounding complications. So here I have a new artboard, and I'm bringing in a photo of two of my favorite people. In order to turn this into a vector, we're going to do the same thing that we did with the Tom and Jerry cartoon, and we're going to go to Image Trace, and here is where those presets come in. We're going to choose High Fidelity Photo and hit Trace, and it's going to give us a warning, but we ignore that and we go ahead anyway. And once it's done tracing, we're going to expand. And here we see that we have an exponentially larger amount of anchor points that we can manipulate and that also become really tricky to manipulate. It can take some time and patience to really figure out how to change each of these little layers. But it is doable and you should experiment to your heart's content. So we've learned how to turn imported assets from rasters to vectors using our image trace. Sometimes things we create in Illustrator are rasters as well. And before we send this file to a printer, we need to have everything in vector format or it just won't show up. So let's move back to our first exercise. All the text we created is in raster format. This is a default. Text automatically is built as a raster asset in Illustrator. Other assets such as shapes and strokes are rasters too, or they can be. And if you're not sure which is which, there are a couple easy ways to find out, but let's use our selection tools to determine which is which. So let's switch to our white arrow and we click on our number. We don't see any anchor points. We see this baseline point, which we can move, but we can't directly edit this as we did the other text. So let's change that. Moving back to our black arrow move tool, we're going to select our number. We'll navigate to type, create outlines. And now when we go back to our white arrow and we click on that number, we can see that we really can mess with it. Same thing with this line. I'm going to draw this line here and I can make adjustments to the path itself with our white arrow, but I can't really mess with it the way that we can with other vectorized objects. So here I'm going to highlight the asset, navigate to Object, Path, Outline, Stroke. And now when I click on one of the anchor points, I can really manipulate it. Two important last steps before we save. We want to make sure that everything is vectorized in our image, and we also want to get rid of any overlapping shapes. To do this, we'll go to View, Outline, and we'll notice that anything that's a vector has been displayed as an outlined path. Anything like this here, that's a raster object, it just appears as an empty box. That tells us that it's still a raster and it needs to be converted to a vector. We'll do this in the same way as before. We can do an image trace on the image that we brought in and we can create outlines for the text. We also need to get rid of any overlaps. So in this file, I've made multiples of the same thing. And when I switch to my view outline, I can see that indeed they are all vectorized images, but they all cross over paths. And if I'm cutting out a piece of vinyl, I need the pen to know where to go and where not to go. I don't want to have all these intersections. So what I do is select all of them by hitting Command A, then I bring up my Pathfinder and I unite all the shapes. We'll save this as an EPS file, which is encapsulated PostScript, and we're ready to send it to the DOC to have our vinyl cutouts made.